and we'll be ready to start our session. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, and I welcome you all to the 10th edition of the Lahore Literary Festival on the concluding day of this wonderful festival. And I hope you stay on till the end. There are still many, many more sessions to come. Today's session is titled Writing Our Stories, Decolonizing Lives. And let me start by saying that we certainly have saved the best for last. So without further ado, let me start by introducing our incredible panelists. Let me start off first and foremost with Usman Yousefzada. He is an established fashion designer. His designs have adorned celebrities such as Beyonce, Lady Gaga, Taylor Swift, to name just a few. He is also an artist, and his work, among other notable exhibitions, was also included in the Lahore Biennale in 2020. He is a filmmaker and the author of The Go-Between, which is his memoir, and it had its book launch here at the festival. Then I would like to welcome Dr. Winfunk. She is an author whose epic novel, The Mountains Sing, also had its book launch here at the festival and has garnered multitudes of awards. It is her first book in English, and she's also a translator, journalist, as well as working for the she's also worked for the UN, so welcome, Kwemai. And last but certainly not least is also Dr. Osama Siddiqui. He is the author of Snuffing Out the Moon, which is an epic novel that takes the reader through different civilizations, from the Mohenjo-daro to the Mughals, the modern era, and then even into the distant future. And he is a legal expert, an advisor on law reform, a teacher, and might I add, a regular at the Lahore Literary Festival. So welcome you all, and I would like to start off, Usman, with you. In your book, The Go-Between, you explore the clash of cultures and life lived within a closed migrant community. It seems fantastical, and yet it's all based on true events on how you came out on the other side of the divide, and yet still wanted to look back gently on the life that you had left behind. So tell me, what made you want to write your own story?
I think I really wanted to invite people into a hidden world that you don't really see that often. And it's a really working class world. It's a world of predominantly women, and how women from Pakistan who actually migrated abroad, and the kind of like an insight in those kind of how they created parallel communities because they couldn't necessarily integrate. Yeah. And it was really this kind of world, and especially the background I come from near KP, where the women are much more, it's strictly parda, and those kind of like, those same values were actually taken across to the UK, and you kind of created this microcosm of a very kind of like stagnant, but also kind of a world that was actually quite hostile as well from the outsides.
Wow, that's wonderful.
So it's really like a kind of coming in. It's told from the eyes of a 10-year-old, 11-year-old kid, and I chose a 10, 11-year-old kid because a 10, 11-year-old kid doesn't really judge. I didn't really want to put in kind of what I may think now. So it was really the ideas of just a kid actually just holding a camcorder. He sees a bit of violence on one side, great food on another side, another kind of like storytelling, and then just tries to kind of like accept many kind of things. But then he sees this complexity of the adult world. And that's something what I basically tried to capture in that book, really, because it allowed me not to be judgmental. I think there's so many stories out there of Muslim women and different lives, basically, that could fall into a trap of, I mean, there is, I think we are inherently, there's a patriarchal issue here, but I think there's there's also, I didn't want to kind of fall into too many cliches. It's also a kind of very loving and an insightful world.
Wonderful, wonderful. So to turn from a life lived and experienced, as you say, in all its color and vibrancy, we now turn to a life imagined. Kwe Mai, let me ask you, you wanted to relive the life as you imagined your grandmother would have lived it. And in addition to the emotional implications of making that journey, you also decided to write your debut novel in English, a language that wasn't really a language you were familiar with. And yet you decided to do this because you wanted the world to look at Vietnam through an insider's look, because here was a country that is only known through war, and you chose English to tell your story, and the story of your grandmother and the family and what they went through before the US war in Vietnam. In the 1940s, there was the famine and then land reforms that tore your family apart. So tell me about that, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. I see a full room. You all look so beautiful. I'm so pleased and honored to be in Lahore and to be in the company of such brilliant artists and writers. Thank you so much for being here. You know, I published 11 books, and I write mostly in Vietnamese, but I was a translator, and I felt like I had to translate Vietnamese literature to reclaim the narrative in literature in English about Vietnam, because there have been thousands of books written about Vietnam, but mostly they have been written by Westerners, using Vietnamese people as background to the Western stories. And if you watch Hollywood movies about Vietnam, you see Vietnamese women as victims, as those who need men to rescue them. If you watch the popular Miss Saigon, you will see Kim, the Vietnamese woman who rather die than being a Vietnamese. She committed suicide because her American boyfriend did not come back for her. I wrote against that. I wrote about the Vietnamese women whom I grew up with, who had no choice but to be the pillar of our families, of our society, who had to be the shoulder for men to lean on. So during the war, most of our men had to go to the battlefield, and I came back traumatized. It was the women who rescued those men, who nurtured them, who brought them, who healed them, because there has been so little research done on trauma. So this book is my attempt to reclaim the Vietnamese narrative, and I'm really honored to be here and to have conversation with you. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kwe Mai. I'd like to turn to Dr. Osama. I'm a little intimidated. We have two doctors, not in the medical sense, on the panel. For your story, Osama, you decided to look back not at your immediate surroundings like reclaim the narrative of your place of birth from quite essentially what has been an hello? Yes, it's a very Western-dominated narrative. So was it desire on your part to just write about the birthplace of human civilization, or were you just simply curious?
Thank you. That's a very good question. The more I think about it, I realize that you're driven by things which are not just conscious, but also in your subconscious. And the beauty of the written text is that it's open textured. Even yourself, you interpret it in multiple ways. I think it's a whole bunch of reasons. The first would be that, how we define ourselves in the post-colonial world is very much a function of what happened under colonialism. A lot of the categorizations of people, caste, vocational tribes, all these things were actually introduced. And more recently, in my sort of non-fiction paradigm, I work as a legal sociologist. So I think partially it was to also open up this entire question of identity, because I find us as Pakistanis defining ourselves incredibly narrowly, and also in ways which have been defined for us. We don't have the autonomy. The second thing is that the more I look as a law reform person, as a legal scholar, at what is the predominant language of domination and control, it's the law. And the law in Pakistan still is very much a colonial output. So the deconstruction of that legal project is something which I did as a scholar. Their personal tragedies, their lives. And the third thing I would like to say is that as I started to sort of disassemble the colonial project in my own little way, I realized that this is not something which starts in the 18th or the 19th century. It goes back to the beginning of time. You have this cyclical recurrence of hegemonic structures. Right? So we heard about the Ottoman Empire yesterday, there have been empires before that. And they have evolved in certain ways in terms of their political structure. But the underlying dichotomy of the privileged and the excluded is always there. So that's a fundamental question which fascinates me. So there are reasons which are scholarly, but I tell you, other than this, there is also curiosity. Because all said and done, when I go to a ruin, I find it remarkably evocative. So that's where I think the more poetic, the more picturesque dimension of it fascinates.
So this is something that I'd like all three of you to comment upon. How important do you think it was when you began the process, for example, of writing your memoir, or the life lived by your ancestors, or when it pertains to the social history of a geographical area? How important do you think you felt it was to decolonize writing, as it were, to take it away from people who had written about your community, for example, or written about your country, for example, or in your case, to write about the history of your country, for example? How important did you feel that you had to do this as an active sort of act?
I think for me it was, can you guys hear me?
We can hear you, sir.
Okay. So for me it was really like two things. One was this idea of actually an anthropological work where these stories of migrants which aren't really kind of like told or brought to the forefront. So there's an anthropological book of like 80s and 90s of a particular time where the voyage from one place to another, how they've actually relocated and resettled themselves. And it's a kind of like a period of the same way as construction workers now that have that go to Dubai. So it's very much like a racialized underclass world more than anything else. And then secondly, there's this idea that from the title it's called the go-between. It's this idea of duality. So how can I really decolonize my life because I actually exist across two cultures? It's very different, I think, to actually come from your heritage and you can actually come from your strengths and you can say that I'm Pakistani now and this everything else is actually, I have to ignore everything else. But I don't, I have this hybridity that I have to navigate across these worlds. idea of belonging not here, not there, in this kind of like weird no man's world. And I think that's a kind of space which actually creates kind of quite interesting narratives. And yeah, that's really how I try to kind of like, the decolonization conversation for me is about the voices that aren't necessarily, we hear about kings, we hear about many different kind of conversations, but we don't hear about working class women, especially Muslim women who are illiterate, who are very kind of like, have a very closed world that they aren't. They are actually subjected to this patriarchal world, but they are amazing matriarchs in this sea of patriarchy as well. So this idea of strength against another force. But they've all gone for economic betterment. They've all gone to actually get a new life, basically. And it seems like, you know, both my parents are illiterate, but I went to university. So this kind of like transition that would happen, that would take 3 or 4 generations in a land where social mobility is a lot less, can be sort of turbocharged when people kind of go abroad.
I can have your comment on this. Yes, what?
I love Osman's comment on how we decolonize by writing about ordinary women, right? We don't have, because so much literature have been written about men or about men in power. So it's important to give voice to ordinary women. And I think there were many ways that I decolonized literature about Vietnam. First of all, if you look at my book, my name appears in full tonal marks. Yeah. This may make my book less popular because people can't remember my name. But I made that choice. I don't care how many books I sell. I care more how I represent Vietnam as a culture. A Vietnam that deserves to be respected. Our culture has more than 4,000 years of history, and the world only sees us as the war. I refuse that. I want to present Vietnam as it is, you know, like Vietnamese language is so rich, and each tonal mark gives a meaning. For example, the word MA, you know, like as part of the Western text, we have been published without the Vietnamese diacritics. We have to change our language to fit the Western ears and eyes, you know, and each tonal mark is like the roof of a house. It has a meaning. For example, the word M-A. If you write M-A, it means ma, a ghost. If you put a mark, ma means but, ma means mother, ma means young rice plant, ma means a horse, ma means a grave. So you see, a single word has so many different meanings. So why do we need to change our language to please the Westerners or the English readers? So I refuse to do that. So that's one way that I decolonize, you know, in my book. So there's a lot of Vietnamese language here. Sometimes I don't translate. Sometimes I invite the readers by entering the Vietnamese culture, by guessing the meanings of certain words. I just throw them into the context of the Vietnamese life and say, hey, this is Vietnam, feel it. You don't have to understand exactly, but have a feeling of what this means and be a part of Vietnam. Another way that I decolonize, you know, Vietnam via this book is to put the Vietnamese stories in the center stage. Even though this book is set against the backdrop of the Vietnam War, I give Americans no speaking role. Americans have no speaking role here. It is the Vietnamese and our stories, because the Vietnam War killed more than 3 million Vietnamese. It killed more than 68,000 Americans. But more literature have been written about Americans than Vietnamese. And I think even though we need many stories, but I think it's time also to pay attention on Vietnamese trauma and how we inflict pain onto each other. What I wanted to show in this book is that Vietnamese, we also do so many bad things to each other. We are not victims, but we cause damage and pain to other Vietnamese. And I also, in this book, instead of, I write against Miss Saigon by showing how the women rescue the men. Yes, we, as Vietnamese grandmothers and mothers have done so much for their husbands, for their sons throughout history, and our roles are not acknowledged. And if we have narratives from women, we can add many things to the narrative. For example, relations among family members, or how we look at nature and how nature can help rescue us. So yeah, so thank you.
Osama, if I can have your comment.
So I can relate very closely to both of you. You in the sense that you said that I'm actually showcasing voices which are not normally showcased or amplified. And you in terms of how you have emphasized the distinctiveness of the Vietnamese culture, the language, and let me also say this because I've had the privilege of having read your book, that despite the fact that you have such clear, shining politics, which is a big driver, it's an incredibly lyrical work. And the very fact that it is so Vietnamese in terms of its imagery, in terms of the flora, the fauna, the rituals, the relationships, the nuances, I think that in itself is an act of decolonization, because 20, 30, 40 years ago, if you look at South Asian fiction being written in English, there was both a huge amount of uncertainty about the idiom which is to be used and the themes which have to be spoken about. There is a lot more self-confidence. Now, the automatic question which I face all the time, and perhaps you face as well, is why English? And I consider that also an act of defiance, right? So it's a language which is a sine qua non as far as the modern world is concerned, knowledge production. Why should we also not co-opt it? So I don't necessarily look upon it as hegemonic. Now, this is not mutually exclusive. This does not take away my appreciation or my deep and profound respect for Urdu and Punjabi and Saraiki and Sindhi. In many ways, our second or our first language also influences the kind of English we write, right? And which is perfectly fine. But to go back to your question and to briefly say a couple more things, what also was very important to me in terms of decolonization, I think as an idea, is who your audience is going to be. I think that's a conscious decision, right? Because I was told by editors that if I emphasize something more, that's what a Western audience would be interested in. I know all the tropes. I can use them as well, right? I have a very convenient name. So I can write about 9/11. I didn't want to, which is not to say it's not important or others shouldn't write about it. So what you choose, what you emphasize, how you say it, which characters populate it, who is given which voice. You look at the history of literature and you will find that who gets the main lines is the dominant force, and who gets the, the really weak lines doesn't. So I think there's language, there is the audience, there is also whether you're thinking about selling the book elsewhere or you're writing for your own constituency, and if it has resonance, it will go out. I think that makes a huge difference in terms of what you're going to write, and ultimately also your politics. Yeah. What is your politics? Because everybody has to have a politics, and even if they say they don't, that means they do, because the absence of politics is also political.
Usman, if I could ask you, I mean, you have been labeled as something of a Renaissance man, and I wonder why you've attracted that label, and what was it in your life story that has compelled this revival? And over here, I'd just like to read out a wonderful quote by none other than the acclaimed novelist Hanif Qureshi, who writes about your book. It's a poetic and moving book. Usman paints pictures with words, unfolding hidden stories that stay with you beyond the final page. So why this sort of revival? Why did you think you needed to shake things up? And I'll just put this thought across to Osama also, since he's the legal reformer, and I know I'm qualified lawyer. I know how bound in and caged you are by precedents. You're not really allowed to step beyond a certain sort of boundaries. So if I'd like your comments first and then to go over to Osama.
So my question was, why did I...
Why do you think you have attracted this label of being a Renaissance man? Why are you going about shaking things up and not doing things in the way that things are normally done?
I think kind of probably extending from what Osama said, that actually if you don't have politics, that's also a statement, I mean, in itself. I think I have an interdisciplinary practice, and that practice is across a series of mediums, but I tell the same story across many mediums. It's the same story of migration, it's the same story of the underclass, it's through my work in my paint work, my installations, my sort of sculpture, the conversations I have in the design space, and also on the tech space. But I think that's also quite a political statement of being interdisciplinary, because I think what interdisciplinary allows you to, generally we actually work in a branded world. So if I was selling paper cups, I'm a specialist in paper cups, and everyone can put me in a box and they can actually transact with me. So I can become the best paper cup supplier in the world, basically. But I think for me to have a fuller, more, and if I wanted a brain surgeon, I'd definitely go to a brain surgeon rather than actually another generalist to be able to do one particular thing. But I think as a person who is a producer of culture, I think for me I feel like I use the same narrative across different mediums, and that just allows me to reinforce those stories in many different ways. And so what I try and do is actually I create environments which are kind of safe spaces for me. So they're kind of like depictions of migrant spaces, and they come, they're talismanic, they kind of come from ritual. So how do I keep myself safe in a space which is my space? I mean, everyone has I grew up quite communally, but the idea of notion of a bedroom is actually very your own kind of like idea of safe spaces. And you can shut the world away. So it's these kind of like spaces where that's what I create basically, and that's through a series of installations. So I hope that kind of has answered your question. So for me, interdisciplinary is or being a Renaissance man, which I don't necessarily like, but
it's what I read on one of the reviews about your work. You have to take it whether you like it or not.
But it's really a kind of a very political act, because I don't want to be defined. I don't want to be like be able to transact in a world where I just become a specialist on one particular thing, because that's how commodities work.
Thank you. Thank you. Osama, please.
So, to the extent that your question was about how do you conceive reform, considering that law is considered to be so sacrosanct, so bound, so formalized. So I think the tradition or the philosophical bent to which I belong stems from this movement in the US called the Critical Legal Studies Group and American Legal Realism. So you cannot reform unless you demystify. Yeah. And the major contribution, the intellectual contribution these people have made over the years is to say that law is nothing but an economic and political compromise. You can have very different compromises. So in other words, you have a land law regime, you have an inheritance law, you have a contract law. It could be completely different. Depends on which politics prevails. What has happened with law, which is very unfortunate, is that they have at times taken it to a pedestal where even hegemonic law is made to look like something sacred, something sacrosanct. And this happened during the colonial project, this happens now. Now I completely understand practically that law has to be given a higher status, because otherwise you won't have deference to the law. But we need to decouple law from justice. When law becomes unjust, that is the time to revisit it. And there's nothing sacred about it. It can be dismantled, it can be demystified. And that's a project which I've been at my own little level undertaking when I do non-fiction work, in terms of looking at the colonial roots, looking at the imperatives of laws which were introduced to this part of the world a century and a half ago, and we're still holding on to it, like slavishly, not looking at the ground realities, not looking at people's aspirations. And that's also something which I've tried to do through fiction.
Great, great. To just continue with this whole theme of decolonizing writing and lives as a result of it, I'd just like to ask you, I mean, how important do you think it is to re-educate people about slavery, about colonialism? In your case, Usman, you've made a film about Bangladeshi garment workers and showed the world sort of the plight of this bonded labor, as it were. These Bangladeshi women are working atrocious hours, underpaid workers. And in your case, Koimai, you know, the whole sort of legacy of colonialism. And so how important was it to re-educate people about this whole narrative of slavery and colonialism? You could have just said, well, you know, the past is another country, you know, let's move on. But you decided to talk about slavery, talk about colonialism, talk about imperialism. Tell me something about that. What made you do that? Yes, you, yes, absolutely.
So for me, I think, you know, I mean, who writes history at the end of the day, and that narrative stays. And I think the reason why I wrote this book was actually because those histories will get forgotten, because me, you know, children, my nieces, everyone will be going to university. They'll have a very different life to the life basically people had at a particular time. And I think that was the reason to actually write those, because there was the racism that I actually faced in those countries when my uncle was beaten up, so he wasn't, by white supremacists, where he wasn't really allowed to, he couldn't leave the house again. So this kind of idea where these stories are kept, and, you know, words basically, I mean, okay, sometimes words are dead in libraries and no one really reads them, but hopefully this won't be the case with this. But so it was a form of activism to actually write this book. And in the same way with actually working with garment workers in Bangladesh was, so they make these clothes, they make mass-produced clothes for the world. And they make these clothes, and they're very much at one point of the production cycle. And these clothes that they make, they don't necessarily know who they make these clothes for. They are put on a ship halfway around the world, and we go and see them in H&M's and these kind of like big branded stores and Mango. And what we see is, I kind of went back and I found all these clothes which are great condition, what I give to maybe what's called the Landa Bazaar here, or what's given to charity shops. So I went around actually picking all of these clothes up, probably about sort of 20 pieces, and I took them back to Bangladesh after someone had already had a life with them, worn them, and then felt that they weren't going to throw it away in the dustbin, but somehow that they were going to give them to someone else, and someone else was going to have a better life with them after they had actually used it. So I took them back to Bangladesh, and I was managed to get access to a group of workers, and I asked them to engage with these clothes. So it was this idea of this prodigal son somehow returned, this cycle. And eventually that became a piece of work, which was shown at the Whitechapel. And I asked them to imagine who they were making clothes for. And then what came out was kind of so profound, was just kind of still makes me, it changed my practice in many different ways. I mean, what they said was, these people are taller than us. These people are blonde, blue eyes, they are taller than us, that's why they're more beautiful. They actually eat different types of fruit, that's why they're kind of more beautiful. This kind of whole idea, and the idea of dreams was actually so significant in that world. They said, I can only dream as much as I can afford. And it's very different to what I kind of grew up with in the West. Is like, you know, if you can become the president's son, you can become the president if you're still a working class kid in America. That somehow is a dream that we're kind of like pummeled with. You work really hard, but it's the whole idea that you can't necessarily transcend or be socially mobile And this you could only dream in these kind of like small compounds was kind of quite profound. So it's these kind of conversations that I'm always kind of quite interested, the same way with the book, of these women who don't necessarily have a voice, basically. They weren't even allowed to go to the bank to save, so they created their own saving committees. So it's just this kind of how people move through different spaces.
Khoi Mai, you can have your comment.
You know, I wish that Vietnam had a literature festival like this, when we can talk about decolonization, because we have no such festivals. Can you believe it? And I think the act of decolonizing is not just, it doesn't belong to writers and academics. It belongs to everyone. We have to decolonize in everyday's action. For example, in Vietnam, I reflect on what Osman just said. In Vietnam, we perceive the white people as more beautiful. So that's why we have billboards with Western models as the models, you know, for beauty products, for clothing. We use the Western image as the model of being beautiful. Why we should appreciate our own beauty? You know, we have so many types of whitening cream. You know, women prefer to be white because being white is more beautiful. And I think it's the time that we appreciate, you know, our own characteristics. And I think it's really like Vietnam has been subject to colonization for so many generations. We were occupied by the Chinese for so many years. So our language has so many Chinese words. And also we use French words, and a lot of writers these days, they also have English words as part of the Vietnamese text as well. So I think being conscious of being authentic to your culture, to your language, and to protect the essence of your language is really important, you know, because it's not for the sake of convenience and use all of these Western terms. And I think it's really important to talk about decolonization. And I think this is a very new topic in Vietnam. And I started to write about it, and people were surprised with the concept because we haven't thought much about it. So I really hope Vietnam has a festival like this when we can discuss freely about, you know, the need for change from all of us.
Osama, we can have your comment.
So I guess the biggest and clearest indication that hegemony exists is the fact that you're not allowed to speak about it. So I think we have a very sort of rich history of defiance. And the biggest sort of challenge has always been the impediment on free speech. And even now, you know, 70 years later, as we know, in recent weeks, we have heard about all kinds of ways of curtailing speech, about the military, about the judiciary, and our sort of constitutional right to speak, to politically assemble is a constant battle. And I think Pakistan has done better than a lot of other countries. There is hope there, but you know, we have a long way to go. And I say that because we can say these things here, we've been saying it for years. Of course, there's a difference. If you're from Balochistan and you're speaking in a local language and you're not from a privileged background, your freedom is much more limited. If you're sitting here and amongst the elite in the main metropolis speaking in English, chances are the people who are monitoring you will not understand you, or they'll overlook because they'll think that you are only decipherable to a very few people. So I think talking about it is the first thing. I mean, I read Toni Morrison fairly late in the day. And when I read Beloved, I was just blown over by the emotiveness and the rawness of it, and the fact that she felt that even this late in American history, she has to write such a book. And despite such a book and despite so much such literature, there are swaths of ignorance, even in the United States of America, about the slavery experience, and the brutality of it tells you that this conversation is so very vital. In our part of the world, with its asymmetric access to education, because of the linguistic divides and all that, I think we haven't even begun to start telling people about what their predicament is, what the main challenges are, who suppresses their speech. and so conspiracy theories prevail. So I think the oxygen which we really need is that space, and I think writers have a very essential job there. And you also see writers paying a huge price for it. May it be in Egypt or in Turkey or in so many, or in Burma. Or Vietnam. And Pakistan, time and again.
Yeah.
So in many ways, this book is about dissenters. It's about people who actually speak to power, who confront it.
That's the question I was going to come to next, because Usman, in your book also, you write about how you sort of having a dialogue with different religious figures of authority, and this clash with authoritarianism and dissent, as Osama writes about in his book, and of course also clash with authority with you, Kwame. So if I can just have a comment about this, I mean, you know.
I think for me, I kind of wrote a book which was, I thought it was very loving, but I felt I wrote a book and I lost a family. So part of my family is not necessarily speaking to me after I've written this book. So it's this kind of real, in a micro level, that's my kind of power struggle. On a more wider level, I think just the ideology of how we rid ourselves of this pure wave of how we're trying to rid of anything which is Hindu derivative in our culture, and everything which is seen as actually it's not us, but we are from a land which actually has a strong history, and the idea that Islam should be one particular thing. I think, I mean, for me, it's like there's one God and there's many people. Everyone has a different brain and they have different interpretations to that one connection. And I think that should be actually very open. So I think that's also this idea where, especially the area that we come from, there was this wave of actually, this is bid'ah, this is shirk, this is this whole idea of actually cleansing this idea of what your religion means to you. And I don't know, and I think we've lost many things because of that, basically, especially in my kind of communities that I come from. And the other thing that I basically thought was that when I grew up in a very confined space, and as a young kid I came to Pakistan, I saw a much expanded culture. So I saw people dancing at weddings, and I saw many different things kind of happening. But back in Birmingham in the UK, when I was growing up, this culture was much smaller. And it was actually like, hi, this isn't actually being a Muslim, you can't do this is not. So it was this kind of real like duality where your culture becomes like very narrow and then your culture becomes very wide. And as I grew up, I want to kind of like keep my culture much more wider than allow it to be much more narrow.
I think one of the ways for us to decolonize our writing is to write about forbidden topics, you know, and uncover the untold stories, because Vietnam has a history of more than 4,000 years, and we are forbidden to talk about some parts of our past, and parts that I wrote about it in my novel. And actually I lost many nights of sleep thinking, can I tell these stories? What danger do I pose to myself and to my family? And like Osama said, you know, not writers for many countries have to pay the price, and we accept that. Because as a writer, you need to tell your own truth as you see it. Yeah. If you do not write your truth, this is not the book that belongs to you, that you know, that I think writing is about freedom, and I think the more free we feel, the better we can write. And I really hope for a world where everyone can write what they feel is true. And you know, yesterday or the day before, I attended a session, at the opening ceremony, when I heard about the situation in Egypt, where, you know, people are imprisoned because they retreated a tweet. And I mean, that's unthinkable. You know, we are in this world, in these modern days, how can this happen? But you know, freedom is so precious. And I really hope for every writer to have the freedom and the courage to tell the story they are born to tell. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Osama?
So I think both my colleagues have put it so very well, and I can only echo them, but I'll just add a few more words to say that this is the reason why writers are not very well liked in totalitarian regimes or populist regimes, because I think ultimately writers owe it to themselves and to their context to say what they see. And that truthfulness has to be there if there is to be any integrity to their work. Now, look at our biggest challenges across the globe. One of the sort of predominant things happening is this tendency towards centralization, towards uniformity, towards a single nation, towards a single national curriculum, right? You can have a very good single national curriculum if you really think it through. But if the idea is just to typecast people and to just be hegemonic, then it's a problem. So I think writing ultimately, and diverse writing, is essential because you cannot have a healthy society unless you have plurality. And I think this is a pluralist country. I personally, as a constitutional student, find that the ethos of Pakistan was a pluralist polity. There is so much evidence. Of course, we are given counterexamples which are very problematic. And I think in many ways, our larger sustenance as a pluralist nation depends on how much do we allow a diversity of people to be able to tell their stories. And that is not just at the municipal or the national level, it's also, as Chikambamba Adichie says, at the international level, right? We have multiple stories. There's no Pakistani story. When you see a book coming out, you know, the Iranian novel, what does that mean? It's a large, complex, talented, brilliant nation of great provenance, right? So Iran has 100,000 stories. We need to tell them.
So we're talking about writing our stories. Usman, I mean, when you go back and when people encounter you and they look at you and you look like somebody who talks the talk and yet doesn't walk the walk. So how do you deal with that? And Kwemai, you're a translator, I know, and so many things are lost in translation. So this is just another comment that I'd like all three of you to make after you've answered my question. Osman, I'm going to hold you to it. How much is lost in translation when you're writing your story? So can we go first?
Is it the talk
yes,
or the
yes,
walk?
Yes.
I saw, so how much you lost in translation?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, you know, when you're writing your stories, how much is lost and how much is gained? You do gain a very specific identity when you put yourself out there with a book like this.
I mean, I think for me, I think probably I had a profile before, so it was easier to, they wanted me for it to kind of inhabit a non-fiction world into a memoir world. So it was like, hey, look at this guy, he's got this backstory. And it was something that the publisher would normally actually want to use that to sell a book. But this is not really about my work. It's just up to a period of time, up to the age of 18, and it's the same. Predominantly, it's from a kid's view, where he's telling everyone else's stories, and it's not necessarily about him. So I don't really. I kind of like lost my train of thought there, but it was like
how difficult is it for you? I mean, you do have your atelier in Fitzrovia, you do head a business, and you do a lot of things. I mean, do you feel writing your story has somehow dented your saleability? Because you have come so far doing what you have done. You are known for the great interdisciplinary designing that you do. So, I mean, just telling your stories, do you think?
Yeah, I think basically for me, as a concept of a memoir changes, like it's memory basically. So for me, memory actually meets also fiction. All the stories are true, but I think what you remember is actually different. At 10, what you remember at 20 is very different, and what you remember at 30 is very different. And that's kind of like these ideas of life experiences that you go through. So you look through life through a different lens at different times of your life, basically. And I think that's what and hence I think the world of fiction actually meets memory. In France, the memoir doesn't sit in non-fiction, it sits in fiction. And, but in the UK, memoir sits in non-fiction. So in a way, for me, I changed everyone's names, I made composite characters, but like in Firbi, like part of my family still looking for themselves in these kind of like stories just to beat me up with a stick. But it's this kind of real idea of, for me, it's an anthropological kind of exercise of how to be able to, an important book that actually just solidifies a period of time, and that's all.
Great. And Kwemai, can we have your comment on, since you are a translator and you probably do lose a lot when you're trying to put out the essence of your thought, but so what is lost in translation in your words?
I think, you know, because I am so conscious of protecting the Vietnamese culture, so that's why it took me 7 years to write this book. And, you know, I translated a lot of proverbs for the novel. And, you know, sometimes it took me months to translate a singular proverb because I wanted to protect the essence of these proverbs because, like, they are the wisdom of our ancestors passed from one generation to the next. So I worked a long time on translating certain things, but I wrote this book in English, and I think what I lost is, like, I lost 7 years of my life and a lot of nights of sleep, and I gained a lot of white hair. But I gained myself through this book. I gained myself and my faith in humanity, because if you read this book, you feel the sense of hope. So actually, I lost many family members due to wars and conflict, and I wanted to write about them, to understand them. And in the end of the book, I found forgiveness for those who killed my family members. So I have a grandmother who was killed in the Great Hunger of 1945, and I invented a character in the book, the character who killed my grandma in real life. And I wanted to do so many bad things to him. And that's what fiction can do, you know. You can do so many bad things to the people whom you dislike. So be careful around novelists, yeah? But actually, in the end, I found out that I'm not a violent person. I cannot inflict bad things to this person, because as a human being, I need to learn how to forgive. And I think our world would be a much better place if we forgive, if we know how to forgive, because the circle of violence will not stop until we all know how to forgive.
Thank you. Osama, can we have a comment from you?
So, look, we can easily agree that we are pretty good people, writers, you know. So, no, but seriously, I think writing, translation to me, frankly, my considered view is that it's as enigmatic a process as the writing itself. I really think so, because I think it's an act of reinterpretation. It's not well, no good translation is literal. But if you look at the great translations, I think you need to somehow reimagine that world and somehow bring it to another language. So I'm not a translator, but I've had a very close experience of translating this book, not me translating, a very good translator, Asim Bakshi did it, but I worked closely with him. And so it was a very interesting experience for him as a translator and for me as a writer, as we shared his interpretation of my text and my rendition of it and reached compromises, happy compromises. But I thought it was also important, because I think it's also linked to our earlier conversation, for this book to be available in Urdu. And I'm well conversant in Urdu, and I could have done it myself, except that it would have perhaps precluded me from writing the next one. And secondly, there are people far better than me who can do it, right? So, but I thought that it's remarkably ironical and contradictory and hypocritical even, that I talk about all this and then I write in English and then it goes to a privileged few, at least in this part of the world. And so I think one of the most satisfying thing has been to see it now available in Urdu, to have an entirely different readership, a very intelligent and a very engaged readership, and for whatever they're worth, the essential ideas being engaged with by those people.
Well, I'm sure your readers will forgive you for writing in English. I'm sure we've all learned a lot from this session. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. Otherwise, we had wanted to take some questions from the audience, but we have to make way for the other session. Thank you so much. We've had a wonderful discussion. We had a wonderful audience. Please stay on for the rest of the day. It's the last day of the LLF, so enjoy all that we can offer. Thank you.